Everyone loves Balan Wonderworld, 2021's Game of the Year. Its flawless design and fast-paced gameplay allowed for this game to be well recognised in the general gaming community. However, there is one tiny flaw about the game that the entire global population has come to realise. The 12th and final world in the game is terrible. Amongst the millions of Balan Wonderworld speedrunners, only a handful of people have completed runs, because it takes sheer willpower and a buttload of caffeine to complete World 12 without falling asleep. But, during everyone's year-long comatose state, a group of dedicated Balan speedrunners worked diligently and finally found a way to make these levels genuinely exciting. This is the story of how speedrunners fixed Balan Wonderworld's slowest levels. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. The reason that World 12 is terrible is mainly because of how you have to play it. 12.1 and 12.2 are two of the biggest levels in the entire game, and are levels that are mostly played in an indoor, confined space, which forces the player to play Balan Wonderworld by the rules. Balan Wonderworld is a very flawed game. The gameplay from a casual perspective is slow-paced, uninteresting, and lacks a lot of depth, especially if you compare it to popular entries in the 3D platforming genre. The game features 80 costumes which change your only action, jumping, to something else. In most cases, this benefits the player as it lets them float, attack enemies, or open doors, but in some cases this will prevent the player from jumping, which prevents them from platforming in some scenarios. The reason why people would choose to run this game is that most levels in the game are wide open and easily exploited due to most objects having collision which you can stand on. Combine that with two very broken costumes, Double Jumper and Frost Fairy, the former allowing you to climb vertical sections with ease, and the latter allowing you to cross large gaps quickly by doing light mashes of the jump button. When broken costumes meet exploitable levels, you start to speed up the game considerably. As World 12 doesn't allow for much exploration or exploitation, it hasn't changed much since the game was first routed. This sucks because World 12 has a handful of dull enemy arenas, doors to unlock, and unbearably drab auto-scroller segments. In order to beat the game, you need to beat every boss and level, so World 12 cannot be skipped. So for this segment of the run, you're almost forced to play casual Balan Wonderworld, something that I wouldn't even wish for my worst enemy. Despite being a mess of a game at some points, Balan Wonderworld is a game that hasn't really been broken heavily. Most skips found in the game are done within the boundaries of the game, and the game features a very little amount of glitches. This made the idea of breaking World 12 seem like a pipe dream, but during the second quarter of 2022, the small but passionate Balan Wonderworld speedrunning community started to see a renaissance, and the idea of breaking World 12 came up in conversation again. We will be looking at 12.2 first in this video, so before we get into the details, let's begin with a very brief tour of the level. 12.2 starts the player off in a room full of crushes and shockwaves with an enemy arena at the end. Kill the enemies to progress to the next series of obstacles, a rotating room, a tilting platform, moving platforms, and switches. Fall down this section, find Balan lying in the trash where he belongs, and work through another room with crushes and shockwaves to make your way to the mini-boss. This boss likes to run away from you and is only vulnerable when he goes to attack you. Hit it 3 times to defeat it, and proceed to the final section of the level where you will ride this very slow moving platform through this giant cube room to the giant crystal thing that completes the level. Now the biggest problem is of course the mini-boss and the final platform, so the speedrunner and strat finder, Silent M, started analysing the level for anything that could potentially allow for a skip. One thing that Silent noted was that the rotating room close to the beginning of the level presented small gaps during part of its rotation, and on the 17th of April 2022, Silent and another runner, Wowinim, would start to play around with the rotating room, and Wow would get stuck in the corner with Frost Fairy and then mash jump out of the corner and slip out of bounds. And just like that, the first barrier to skipping 12-2 was finally broken.
You can get out of bounds with Frost Fairy.
Now that they could go out of bounds, Silent and Well began to explore the level to find a way to get back in bounds. Unfortunately, most objects in the game have a two-way collision, meaning that you cannot simply go back in bounds like in some other games. Getting to the end of the level as well took a lot of platforming, which took a while but was easily doable. Silent then found a way back in bounds. This was done by using a costume known as Itsy Bitsy Elf, which has a much smaller collision than every other costume. He used this costume to squeeze into a small gap and fall into the room with the slow moving platform, skipping most of the level and the mini-boss. However, there was one problem with this strategy. This small gap was located on top of this extremely tall structure, and the only way to access the top is with the Balan costume, an extremely broken costume which lets you fly. This costume is banned in normal any percent, and even if it wasn't, obtaining the costume is a slow, grindy and RNG heavy process. This was a step in the right direction, and this did not deter the Balan speedrunners from finding other ways back in bounds. Silent would then investigate the outside of the cube room and would discover another gap that allowed him to get back in bounds. By using the Balan costume, it was possible to land on this small platform and jump between the gap between these two cubes. At the top is a platform to stand on, and in front of you is the end of the level, which Silent reached with ease. This was a much faster skip than the Itsy Bitsy Elf strategy, as it also skipped the slow moving platform, but this still required the Balan costume to reach. Luckily, Silent would discover that you could reach the platform below this gap from close to where the rotating room was by using either the Soaring Sheep or Floaty Flower, two costumes that allow you to slow your descent. From the rotating room, you could soar across a large out-of-bounds space and land on the platform by this gap. A member of the community, Swagsire, would then suggest something that would remove the need for the Balan costume. This costume is never used in the speedrun, so it was easy to forget about. This was Iron Apollo. Iron Apollo allows the player to reach heights greater than that of any percent's best jumping character, Double Jumper, but comes with a major downside. This costume moves and descends really, really slowly. However, the heights that Apollo can achieve is just barely enough to reach the platform. We finally had a way to skip 12-2, but the only issue was with the routing. We had to trade Double Jumper for Apollo, which is a terrible trade, and would slow down a lot of the remaining run. We weren't done with improving this strategy just yet though, so we kept hunting. During the hunt for a better way into the cube room, I would accidentally find and fall into a gap that put me in the cube room, back in bounds. However, where I was after being put back in bounds was very low compared to where the end of the level was, and there was no viable way to climb up. Silent would then discover that you could get much closer to the end of the level through this gap by using Frost Fairy to fall into the gap, and then use the costume's flight to reach the cube on the other side of the wall. This put him much closer to the end of the level. Silent would then discover the piece of the puzzle that would complete everything, making a fast 12-2 out-of-bounds skip possible. This corner next to where he landed his Frost Fairy flight is a glitchy corner. I discovered glitchy corners a few days prior. Some corners in the game are glitchy, as the name would suggest. Frost Fairy's flight is temporary, and the duration of that flight is based on how long the jump button is held. I would discover that if you fly into these glitchy corners with Frost Fairy, then you would gain height as if you were flying, but without using up any of Frost Fairy's flight timer. This meant if there was a glitchy corner that extended infinitely, then you could gain infinite height. However, there isn't a corner like this in the game. Glitchy corners are very rare, so nothing useful up until this point was found. Silent used a few glitchy corners in this area to get high enough in the cube room to fly over to the end of the level with Frost Fairy, saving a large amount of time over the old Iron Apollo route. Even more time would be saved, as Silent would discover that you only had to climb up the first glitchy corner. There was a cube nearby that you could get on top of by using Double Jumper. This puts you just in range of the end of the level with a good Frost Fairy glide. I would then discover that glitchy corners allow Double Jumper to jump infinitely, and climb these corners faster than Frost Fairy, speeding up the skip even more. And just like that, we had a fully functional 12-2 out-of-bounds route. This skip had a couple of unavoidable drawbacks though, the first being that you had to defeat the enemies at the start of the level without a costume known as Inky Blaster. This is a costume that could quickly dispatch these enemies. This section of the level is luck based, as the enemies that spawn are random based on a few seeds, and the worst seed can lose you a lot of time. Without Inky Blaster, this time loss is amplified. Finally, 2 fast Balan statues had to be swapped with slower statues in other levels. I forgot to mention this, but you need 110 of these to beat the game. The level would now look like this. Enter the first room, grab the statue to your right, pray that the enemies are stompers and kill them quickly. Enter the rotating room, get stuck in the corner with Frostfairy and then get out of bounds from there. Stand on this block and switch to Floaty Flower. Soar across this massive gap and land down here outside the cube room. Fall into the gap with Frostfairy and climb onto this platform on the other side. Switch to Double Jumper and climb up the glitchy corner and get on top of this preceding cube. Switch to Frostfairy and finish the level. This route made 12-2 a much more exciting level to play. This route saved around 90 seconds even with the previously mentioned drawbacks. Now all that was left was to break 12-1, the worst of the two levels. So, why was 12-1 so bad? Well, let's take a further look, shall we? 12-1 begins with a slow auto-scroller platform, which is soon followed up by another auto-scroller platform. Once you're through all that, you then have to do another auto-scroller. Midway through that auto-scroller, the level will rotate and the auto-scroller will continue even more. Then, once it's finally at the end, there's more. You then have to defeat these enemies to open the door to progress, and they only spawn when the platform reaches its destination. And then, when you finally get through all that, you have to do it all again. This time, there are enemies, blocks and lasers to dodge, but it's still painfully slow and features another level rotation. Once you're at the end, you then have to hit 3 switches to open the door. Again, this door will only open once the platform reaches its destination. Finally, cross this giant gap to finish the level. This level was an absolute pain. Luckily, the first 2 auto-scrollers could be skipped. The first was achieved by gliding off of these blocks with Frostfairy over this wall. The second one could be skipped by using Frostfairy to navigate on some level geometry. But the biggest problem was of course the third and fourth auto-scroller. The third auto-scroller had nothing, you just had to ride it out. On the fourth, you could be a little bit efficient by navigating on these moving blocks to begin hitting the switches earlier. Doing so would allow you to get through the final door sooner. If we could skip either of these 2 auto-scrollers, then this would benefit the speedrun greatly. But the fact that the level rotated and was completely enclosed within an indoor area meant that we weren't sure what we were dealing with. Like 12-2, nothing much was done with 12-1 until Silent started doing some serious strat finding for Balan Wonderworld in February of 2022. During this month, Silent would discover an interesting oversight in the level. Silent would play through the level until he reached the end of the third auto-scroller. He would hit the checkpoint immediately after and exit the level, back to the hub world. He would re-enter the level and turn back towards the door which he went through from the auto-scroller, and the level was unloaded. This was the first look at 12-1's Out of Bounds, and it was a mess. Unfortunately, nothing could really be done, as the only costume that could navigate the void was the Balan costume. But this discovery was the first domino to fall for bigger things to come. Around April of 2022, during the hype surrounding the initial Out of Bounds discovery in 12-2, I would be messing around in a call with some Balan speedrunners, and I had a weird thought. I reckon that nobody has tried to fly up to the entrance of the third autoscroller after it had rotated. It would be impossible to do with standard costumes, but the Balan costume would have no difficulty whatsoever. And I am glad I tried it, because what I would find would be a major discovery. The door that you entered this autoscroller through should be sealed once the platform starts moving, but after it rotates, a small gap is presented. Does this gap go back to the previous corridor? No. It leads right out of bounds. This was a much faster setup than Silent's method, as in theory, you could access this as soon as the level rotates midway through the autoscroller. The fact that you needed Balan was an issue, but I would have another idea a couple of weeks later. Why don't we let the autoscroller play and we would just lurk near the entrance? I placed myself against a wall so that when the level rotated, I would safely fall onto the wall. This worked perfectly. I could then use the Frostfairy to simply glide to the gap in the door, and I was out of bounds. This was huge. Just like in 12-2, we had found a viable way to exclude Balan from our out of bounds skip, but 12-1 would suffer the same way 12-2 did. We need a way back in bounds. 12-2 had multiple gaps that the player could re-enter the boundaries of the level through, but 12-1 on the other hand was completely sealed. Getting to the end of the level was easy enough, as a few frost fairy glides from the door would allow us to reach the area where the end of the level was located, but accessing the end seemed unfeasible. We had the way out, it was easy, we just needed a way in. And if you're one of the few keen-eyed Balan runners, then you may have noticed that the end of the level has a giant hole in the ceiling. Why not use that? Well, you see, we tried that, but you need Balan to get up there, but that's not the problem. That hole is fake. If we were going to reach the end of the level, we would need to do something that had not been achieved in Balan Wonderworld at this point. The only feasible way to do this was to clip in somehow. This seemed like a lost cause, but the same creative minds who broke 12-2 would combine to work something out. Wowinim and Silent M were on the case. When Wow was new to the speedrun back in January of 2022, he made an interesting discovery in 6-1. He was messing around with this door, using the small itsy bitsy elf costume that helped in the aid to break 12-2. Wow would get the costume's smaller hitbox under a small gap in the door and switch to a different costume. This made the player character to be too big for the gap and forced them into the door. Wow would discover when doing this that the door's collision was disabled and that he could walk freely in and out of the door, and this state was reset when he jumped. This strategy was interesting for sure, but this door was one of a kind, so it seemed like a niche party trick at the time. Silent would then revisit this idea at the end of April. You see, there is a small area that you can access in the final area from out of bounds. It is a small room with a door leading to the final room. Silent would then head to this room with Frost Fairy, and then with the itsy bitsy elf costume, he would shove himself into the corner and then switch back to Frost Fairy. It looked as though he was stuck at first, but after a little bit of wiggling, Silent clipped through the door, and he was staring directly at the end of the level. He had done it. 12-1 had the major skip that we were looking for. This was no doubt faster, but like 12-2, there were a few drawbacks. For starters, runners would have to do a slower free one so that they could obtain the itsy bitsy elf costume. Then we had to lose a few seconds due to replacing the free statues that we lost in this new route. This didn't really matter though, as we were removing the incredibly slow auto-scrollers in exchange, which was a very favourable trade. In fact, this saved another 70 seconds. The new route would now look like this. Activate the first auto-scroller, then dismount it when you're close to the blocks nearby. Platform off the blocks and land on the first statue. Skip the second auto-scroller and grab the second statue. Now, enter the third autoscroller and activate it. Dismount immediately onto these blocks and stand here next to this weird block. Wait for the stage to turn and fall onto the block. Navigate yourself to the door and go through the gap. Navigate through the level out of bounds to the end of the level and switch to Itsy Bitsy Elf. Perform the clip and proceed to the end of the level. This was much more elegant in execution and fixed Balan Wonderworld's most boring level. And this would be where the video would end. However, there was another level that got fixed soon after World 12 was broken. I used the word fixed, but I should really be saying improved honestly, as the level that I am about to discuss was nowhere near as problematic as the previous two. I am going to discuss 10-1. 10-1 is a level inspired by the MC Escher painting known as Relativity, the one with all the stairs if you couldn't tell. Like 12-1 and 12-2, this level is contained within an enclosed area, but like those levels, you could actually be creative in the approach to the level. This level is a series of vertical climbing sections which could be made short work of with double jumper. The level is lengthy, and this is due in part to many blocked doors that need opening with the help of the Inky Blaster. Each door has its own opening cutscene. Some doors open up to a mirror which flips the level, giving the player a new tower to climb. Entering the mirror also gives a cutscene. Throughout the level, the player has to climb up 3 different towers, open 4 doors, and traverse through 3 different mirrors, which unfortunately made a pretty fun level drag on a little bit longer than you'd like. So, you know how I said that the level flipped when travelling through the mirrors? Well, that's what the game wants you to believe. In reality, the flipped room is just a flipped copy that is neighbouring the original room. Silent would discover this in April by messing around with the game's photo mode, making the camera clip out of bounds to see what was outside. What this meant for speedrunners was that the end of the level could theoretically be reached from the first tower, without having to ascend the other towers, especially if all instances of the level are loaded. Silent's massive brain wouldn't stop there though, as a couple of days later he would find a way out of bounds in 10.1, and this one trumps the 12.1 clip in creativity. Silent, like WoW in 6.1, would be wedging Itsy Bitsy Elf into places it shouldn't be going, and an area of interest was the top of the first tower, where this paint tube is situated. Upon switching costumes, Silent would get stuck in the ceiling, being unable to clip out of bounds completely. He needed a little extra push to do it, and Silent would get this push from the farms of World 1. And to be honest, if you told me a year ago that the costume I'm about to mention would be valuable for a Balan speedrun, then I would have called you crazy. Silent would use the Elastiplant costume, a costume infamously known for being a useless version of Mario Odyssey's onion capture, but it turns out that this costume was far from useless in this case, as the costume's stretchy body was what Silent needed to escape the boundaries of this level. He would wedge himself again, switch to Elastiplant and initiate the stretch, and just like that, he was out. Silent was on top of the towers of 10.1, and all he had to do now was find a way to finish the level. Luckily, this didn't take long at all, as VG Junkie, one of the game's runners / moderators, found a way back in bounds very quickly. There was a convenient space for you to stand at the side of the final tower. All VG did was land there with Frost Fairy, switch to Elf, and fit himself into this small gap. He then simply walked back in bounds, close to the top of the third tower. Unfortunately, at the time, this route would hit a huge roadblock. In order to finish 10.1, you need the Inky Blaster costume to open the two doors, one before the first tower and one to access the end of the level. As it stands, this skip requires 3 different costumes to complete, which is the maximum amount of costumes you can carry at once. If you want to perform this route, you'd either have to find a way to remove one of the costumes from the route, or skip Inky Blaster. This was not a problem for long though. On the same evening that 12.1 door clip was found by Silent, he and VG would start strat hunting to find more places to perform door clips. VG found that you could perform the door clips on this door that leads to the first tower, which is completely identical to the door that leads to the final room. This door clip was rather inconsistent though, and we weren't too sure why it was. Most of the time when you attempted this clip, you would get stuck in some of the door's collisions, but not the door itself. It wasn't until I started experimenting with it more that I was able to work it out. The door consists of 2 objects, the door and these pipe things. Most of the time when performing the clip, the game is checking which objects you are inside of and it will disable the collision. However, the game will only remove one collision. Which collision it removes is based on which object the player is considered to be most inside of. Most of the time, it was the pipes. This logic gave me an idea, which led me to create a consistent setup. If there are times where the game sees you inside the door more than the pipes, then there must be a position or angle that allows you to clip into the door every time. I would put the elf in the corner, turn my camera towards the bubbles on the door texture, and tap forward slightly. I would then switch costumes, and the clip would work. The small tap forward and the camera positioning were enough for the game to recognise that I was inside the door and not the pipes. 10.1 had been solved. The route was fantastic and we could still grab the Balan statues that the old route required and still perform the out of bounds skip. Again, like 12.1, the only drawback was from having to obtain the Elastiplant and equip it into your costume slots upon entering the level. This route though saved around 30 seconds when performed perfectly. You would enter the level, equip Elf and Plant and grab the first 2 statues. From there, you would perform the first door clip and ascend the first tower, grabbing 2 statues along the way. At the top of the first tower, you would climb onto the paint tube, switch to Elf and get wedged in the ceiling, switch to Plant and clip out. From here, you would use Frost Fairy to navigate out of bounds and fall into the space where you can use the Elf to clip back in bounds. There is a statue right next to where you clip in bounds. Grab that and make your way to the next door where you can perform the clip one more time and grab one last statue before finishing the level. These 3 levels were changed dramatically, so it made routing for the endgame a lot more complicated than it needed to be, especially when you needed niche costumes to perform key parts of the skips, and by doing so, you were removing beneficial costumes such as Double Jumper and Inky Blaster from the final segment of the run. Luckily, Silent and I would come up with a route that would fit all 3 routes without wasting much time. You would play the speedrun normally, but change the level order slightly so 7 boss was the level that would meet the unlock criteria for Worlds 10, 11 and 12. This was so runners could have the floaty flower costume ready for 12-2, which would be the first level performed in this segment of the run. At this point, you had Double Jumper and Frostfairy equipped, so you were fully prepared for the first new major skip. After acing the new out of bounds 12-2 route, you would then head to 10-1 and replace Floaty Flower and Double Jumper with Elf and Elastiplant. From here, you would perform the new 10-1 route. As Inky Blaster is still beneficial for the speedrun, 10-2 was completed next so that you could obtain Inky Blaster from 10 boss. 11-2, 2-1 and then 2 boss were completed, as 11-2 and 2 boss can be completed extremely quickly using the Inky Blaster. At the end of 2 boss, Inky Blaster is swapped out for Jelly Jolt, as this costume is required for a fast hit on 12 boss. Then, after 2 boss, it is time for 12-1 with the new route. Once you have nailed the new route, all you have to do is beat 12 boss, complete World 11 and then fight the final boss. And all that was left for the community was for someone to pull off a run with this route, and that person would be me. The first run to include all 3 skips would be a 1:03.26 set on the 30th of April by myself. This run was unfortunately rejected by moderators as there were massive cuts in the footage due to frame drops during the livestream on Twitch. I would later improve this down to a 1:03.07 on the 13th of May, but this run had a huge choke in 12-1 and the levels to follow. I wanted a 1:02, and if I played the home stretch even after the terrible 12-1 just a little bit better, then I could have done it. But 2 days later, on the 15th of May, I would come back with some slightly new strategies and I would get on a run with a lot of potential.
I got such good RNG, holy. Richard, look at this goal. First try. Get him. He's down. And he's down, and I'm gonna take it safe.
And that is the story of how Balan Wonderworld's endgame, the slowest segment in the run, got improved significantly over the course of a month. I know Balan Wonderworld isn't the most exciting game, but the speedrun is definitely worth checking out. I will link the current world record in the description for those who want to watch it. And of course a huge thank you to everyone who contributed to the development of these strategies too. If you liked the video, please consider liking the video or leaving a comment so that the YouTube algorithm can put Balan content in people's suggestions. Anyway, I've been Chiron, thank you for watching this video and I'll see you all soon.